Right, I see lots of faces. Welcome to our webinar, which is sponsored by EORTC, the European Organisation for the Research and Treatment of Cancer, which for nearly 60 years has been at the forefront of collaborative cancer research across Europe. The title of this webinar is "How can we effectively recruit patients for independent trials?" Now, I've contributed to a lot of webinar sessions in recent months explaining what clinical trials are. So we're not doing that because although there is a good presence on the internet explaining that, there's also a good presence on the internet from the drug industry explaining what trials are from their viewpoint. Although companies are obviously not allowed to talk about specific drugs. I felt, and so did others, that we needed to talk about the world of academic clinical studies. These are independent studies, and there are a few independent studies which don't have an academic background, but we'll focus on academic for this afternoon. They're a key element in the mix of cancer research right across the world, and an important contributor to the development of all kinds of better treatment. Academic trials are studies which are not funded by the pharmaceutical industry, although a company may support an academic study by providing access to drugs or technology that's required. The sponsor of an academic study is likely to be a university or a hospital or a charity. EORTC is an academic charity and it develops and runs collaborative studies in cancer. Academic studies are often funded by philanthropic donors, sometimes by government grants, and occasionally large-scale programs with several studies may be funded by the European Commission. Well, what sort of trials are they? There are drug studies and non-drug studies. Drug studies may explore better ways of using the drugs we already have, different dosing patterns perhaps. Occasionally, a new drug may have potential as part of a combination therapy with an older drug or a drug from another manufacturer. And there are drugs already approved which can be valuable in treating a different disease. Academic studies may look at the impact patients report from a treatment rather than the medical effect a drug has on the patient. But drugs are just one approach. Academic studies in cancer surgery, for example, robotics or new techniques using lasers, studies in radiotherapy where new technology such as proton beam is rapidly coming into use. New kinds of imaging using different techniques, both to get images and to analyze them. For example, there's a lot of work going on at the moment using artificial intelligence. And then there are different patterns of care, rehabilitation, and so on. Trials like these are happening all the time. They're happening locally, they're happening nationally, and they're happening internationally. But they don't get the kind of exposure that drug studies have. Excuse me. I was treated on a clinical study some years ago, which compared the first-line treatment for advanced disease with the treatment usually used second when first-line treatment had failed. It was an EORTC study, the first time I'd ever heard of EORTC, in fact. Well, as you see, I'm still here, so for me, that treatment worked. And although the study did not succeed in showing what the investigators and researchers hoped it might show, it was a success because it confirmed that the first-line treatment was the right one to be using first. And that's the one key point about clinical trials. They are there to resolve uncertainty. Uncertainty about a situation, a treatment, or a method of using something like a new drug or a new technology. And that uncertainty can only be resolved through a structured and rigorous process which establishes unquestionable evidence. That is what a clinical trial is for. Because academic studies tend to be asking more complex questions than a simple, is this drug better than that one? They can be harder to explain, both to doctors and to patients. And they're certainly harder for patients in a clinic who feel under pressure because of the condition they're in, much harder for them to understand. Now, this is what we're going to start trying to address through this webinar. We have a former member of the EORTC team, now a medical oncologist in Italy, who will fill in some important background detail. We have one of Europe's leading research oncologists, a professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and a prominent EORTC researcher. And she will give us a deeper look at the breadth of academic work. And our final speaker will be a patient from a rare cancer background, but who is herself an expert on explaining clinical trials to other patients. So settle back, listen carefully, and when you have a question, pop it into the chat box and we'll do our best to answer it later on. So our first speaker today is Dr. Jessica Menis, who is a medical oncologist in the lovely city of Verona. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a deep honor and pleasure for me to give this presentation today. And I really thank very much the EORTC, for which I worked before, for this kind invitation. So these are my disclosures. So first of all, when we deal with clinical trials in oncology, we have to face the fact that it's a complex methodology to develop and to conduct. And this is simply because dealing with cancer itself is complex. Cancer has a complex natural history. It presents many risk factors. It can develop with severe symptoms and often at a very late stage that brings a late diagnosis and consequently a poor prognosis. But chances to be cured, even if they are very limited, they can translate into chances to be treated. And this is really important, since treatment algorithms have largely developed and new strategies are currently in place. For example, here you can see what oncologists currently use for treating advanced non-small cell lung cancer. As you can see, it's a flowchart which is very complex. I don't want you to have a deep look into it, but it's just to give you an idea of how we currently treat cancer patients and what we need to look at today. At the same time, and on the same page, also treatments that we currently use, like immunotherapy or targeted treatments, are very complex in their way of being used and in the toxicity we face every day. And therefore, an integrated and holistic approach is indeed necessary. And this all needs to be in place in the protocol when it is developed by any sponsor. On the same point, new biomarkers are indeed necessary, but at the same time, both physicians and researchers need to face the complexity of getting the tissue being analyzed and being useful for the treatment strategy. At the same point, on the same point, when we try to get the tissue being analyzed in the correct and proper manner, we need always to keep in mind that timelines are very important, because each physician gets every day the question, how long is this going to be taken? So focusing on how does patient recruitment work, I have the advantage, as Roger said, to have worked as a sponsor before and now as an investigator. So here we see the actors on the stage, the patient, the investigator, and the sponsor. And I'll give you an example of where this all starts, from the communication that a treatment has completed its action because the disease has on the CT scan become larger, and then a new treatment chance is offered to the patient, which and the patient might have known this possibility before or not. So knowing that a clinical trial is there brings a lot of hope for every patient that we encounter every day. What does the physician do when an inpatient accepts a new treatment strategy? The investigator simply, the physician goes back to the manual, and the manual is the protocol, the clinical trial protocol. And in the protocol, the chapter that the investigator looks at, it's the selection criteria. The selection criteria can divide into screening criteria, which confirm the possibility to be enrolled, or directly the selection criteria that confirm the eligibility. This difference depends on the study design of each protocol. Certainly, the first and more important criteria of all is certainly the signature of the informed consent. So the patient needs to acknowledge the fact that he would like to participate, and therefore we can start to have a look at the criteria, which we can divide into patient-related criteria or disease-related criteria. Let's focus on the patient-related criteria. Here I give you some examples. There might be protocol focused on elderly patients, patients over 70 years old, or on younger patients. We can have protocols that selected for female patients only or for male patients only. We can select the performance status, which is the one that I would like to focus on my protocol. So there can be good performance status or PS performance status of 2 for patients that are a bit more frail. And then we check the organ function, comorbidities, concomitant medication, and the rules for contraception. The graph on the left side at the bottom of the slide shows you that the stricter the sponsor and the investigator are in designing and selecting the organ function which is safer for the protocol, the less patients, of course, can participate to the trial. So this is something that the investigators need to take into account when they design, and at the same time that the physician needs to carefully check when they select the patients for participation. When we check, on the other hand, the disease-related criteria, we focus on the disease histology, the molecular profile, the stage. We might have different stages to be enrolled, for example, in case of early stage. Metastatic sites that we do not select for the participation. Most of the times this is, for example, brain metastases are a criteria which is not always present in each protocol. The availability of tissue and the previous treatments. One other point which is quite important and is certainly a concern is the analysis on the tissue, if it can be performed locally or if it requires a shipment of the sample, for example, in another country abroad. It might be even another continent. Of course, this requires sometimes the analysis to be done and to give back the result to the investigator. And the patient, again, might not have the time. So it's, again, something that we need to take into consideration. Once all criteria are fulfilled, we can have a go, or if any criteria is not fulfilled, we might have a stop for participation, so the patient is not selected. What do we do then? And what are the challenges? So to give you a first look at the difficulty is certainly the stiffness of the study protocol, which might be related to the sponsor or to the regulatory body that gave an advice on the protocol. So giving again an example, a not clinically meaningful difference, for example, in the heart ejection fraction that might not hamper the safety for the participation, might be a constraint. What does the investigator do? The physician, sorry, do? The physician simply goes to the sponsor and asks the question, can we grant a waiver on that? Can we allow this patient to participate since this difference is not clinically meaningful? Not always, but most of the times, The sponsor, whichever, if either academic or if a private sponsor, might reply that the waiver cannot be granted, since otherwise the treatment strategy for which the protocol is set on might not be acceptable for regulatory purposes. And the other is certainly logistics. The trial might not be open in the center, it might be open in another center, either close by or are far away, and then the patient might not be able to participate, to go to the center where the study is open, and the sponsor again might have a difficulty to open a new site. So this is one of the two constraints that I would like to give a look at. The third and most important is certainly time, because if for some time is money, certainly for us for us physicians, and most of all for patients, time is really important for lives. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I hope everything was clear.
Thank you, Jessica. That was very clear, and some very interesting insights into the challenges that you as an investigator will face, as well as obviously a view too of the challenges which the investigators designing a clinical study face. You know, I've had the privilege of working alongside some oncologists as they've worked on developing studies, and I must admit I haven't always thought of some of those issues to bring them up and see whether they've actually considered them. But that's a beside the story. Our second speaker will put a little more depth into the picture of the academic research world. Professor Wynette van der Graaf is professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and she's also worked at Radboud University in Nijmegen, and she also has a clinical role in Amsterdam, both with the Netherlands Cancer Institute and in one of the hospitals there. So she's got a very comprehensive view of what happens in research. She's been a prominent researcher with the EORTC for many years now and has chaired one of the study groups, in which role I've had the pleasure of working with her. But Wynette, I know, has a really broad and very knowledgeable understanding of the research and its issues. So Wynette, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger, for this very kind introduction, and also thanks to Jessica for your nice presentation. It was a good introduction to mine, hopefully. And of course, thanks to all who are listening today. I will start with sharing my slides. Hopefully it will be successful. If not, let me know. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I had a bit more a helicopter view on the trial conduct, and also from the perspective of a doctor. Why should we select a certain study for patients, and what are the questions that come up in our mind when we are considering a new trial? And that applies to both an industry trial, but also a trial that we want to build up from a study group like the EORTC, or even an in-house study group. So there are examples of trials in different situations. Often, I think many of us know the novel trials, where you can only get a novel drug in the context of a clinical trial. But there can also be trials on surgery, and they are maybe less known, but there has been a lot of trials, for example, looking whether laparoscopic surgery has advantages over open surgery, and there are many other surgical questions that are of interest. A third one is trials in radiotherapy, for example, when schedules are compared of long versus short duration of treatment. which of course has to do with the number of times one needs to travel. Another important issue is if they are asking us to participate in a trial, what is the context? Are these patients, are these trials in a curative setting? So is there an aim for cure of long life? Because then we consider even more not only the short-term toxicity of such a trial, but also long-term toxicity. For example, all the, I can say a bit hype of immunotherapy, of course, that's great what's been done, but we also know there may be endocrine dysfunctions due to immunotherapy that are lifelong. So who is caring for these patients? And when you want to participate in trials, you also have to consider the more longer term toxicity. Trials in the palliative setting aim for response or prolongation or length of life, and also happily increasingly quality of life. So then your question is, how will they measure it? What do I have to do? Do I have to give questionnaires to patients, or are there digital ways of getting all these data there? That's important to consider before starting the trial. And always this toxicity of a certain treatment that's proposed in a trial should be well balanced against the expected gain of any life length or quality of life. Another thing is the trial well designed? Is the study population clear? And it's important to consider whether you have the patients that they describe. If more and more trials are very detailed, so it's not only on breast cancer, but it should breast cancer with a certain expression of targets there. And sometimes the target is very rare. So do you see these patients, or can you better refer the patients in your clinic to another center where they have more expertise and where this study in this certain disease area is more logical? Also important to consider how long will the trial last approximately. And the rare cancer issue, because if you have a very, very rare cancer, then you can consider to be the only hospital in a broader region to lead such a trial. And you have to discuss that with your colleagues. Are you fine with me that I will lead this trial, and next time you do it on another rare cancer issue? So there are kind of policy issues behind it. I think it's good that patients don't know. But for today, it's interesting maybe for you to know that these all play a role. Also important, Jessica referred already to that, and sometimes a lot of tests are required before the study can start, and therefore you have to ask, is that doable in a certain time frame? Sometimes it has to be organized in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And if it's just holiday season and half of your radiologist is not there and there are limited time slots, then of course those who are already on treatment have a priority. So can you do the trial at a certain moment in time in this time frame? And if randomization is in place, it's always important to know, what do they compare? Do they compare a placebo treatment, or do they compare a standard treatment versus a novel one? But do I agree with the standard treatment? Is that standard in our hospital or in our country? So that may also help you to select a new trial. Endpoints are also important. You know, of course, about response to treatment, so tumor shrinkage, but also prolongation of the time to progression, which we call progression-free survival, and that requires regular CT scans. To be honest, within the context of a clinical trial, we make more CT scans than in regular care. So is that possible in the hospital? And of course, we often look at overall survival. That means that the endpoint is later in time and that it requires more follow-up. Well, apart from clinical endpoints are also translational or pharmacological endpoints. Jessica pointed already at that. But that means that you need to take extra blood, extra biopsies, extra scans, and what's the extra burden for the patient, but also for the hospital. And for the patient, it can mean that they have to travel a lot, and is that also foreseen? Does that impact recruitment? Because sometimes patients don't like this, and you can live in an area which patients have to travel a lot, and then they think, I don't want to come extra for all these things, and that can impact the recruitment of such a trial. well, you can understand that endpoints which require extra blood tissue and scans are more time consuming for patients, but also for doctors, but also research nurse, lab personnel. In fact, the whole research organization should be in place when you do these more complex trials. And few patients in complex trials with a lot of extra laboratory and other things are particularly time consuming for your research team and also for you as an oncologist. So if you have a lack of research nurses because they are on maternity leave or whatever, then you have to consider, can I do this trial with all these extras the next coming time? And if an oncologist or a hospital or a research team is not used to such trials and has no, doesn't have the people, it will impact the recruitment of patients in such a trial. Other things is also important. Are there competing trials? That's important when industry asks you, but also when you want to do a trial yourselves. Because sometimes there are similar drugs like checkpoint inhibitor A or checkpoint inhibitor B, and you can't run these studies in parallel because they are directly competing, as you can see here. It can also be that you have different drugs, but for the same group. And who will prioritize to which patients to which trial you want to participate as a patient. Sometimes it's helpful to have different trials for the same patient group, because if drug A doesn't help, you have drug B. But by all means, you have to take this into account if you have different trials in parallel running for the same patient group, because it will have impact on the recruitment of the patients per trial. It can also be in a positive way, because maybe you attract very rare patients to your hospital because you have study A open, and if a patient is not suitable to enter one trial, you can offer them the other trial. So it's not always negative, but you have to consider what you are doing already. And then something that's always very important and not often very well discussed, that's the impact of age. Also, Jessica referred to that. There's really a huge difference whether you treat younger patients or elderly patients. Younger patients in general can tolerate more treatment, and they also want more treatment than older patients. And we have done a project, I will show you the details in the next slide, where we looked whether there's also a preference of younger or elderly for quantity versus quality of life when you start a trial. And that's important to consider. And an important thing is, does a trial measure quality of life? If patients prefer that, like elderly, more than half of them in the trial I will discuss, then you should also measure quality of life. So if patients don't think that length of life is the most important thing, why would you then offer them a trial where you may expect some months of gain in progression-free survival, while you know they will have toxicity and have the burden of being part of a study? So these are things that are very important to discuss and to consider when you want to start a trial. Do I have the right patient population, not only with respect to the tumor, but of course also with respect to what kind of patients do I see? So endpoints impact how attractive a study is and also the pace of recruitment. Here I show you very briefly the results of a study we did where we asked patients with a metastatic soft tissue sarcoma before start of first treatment in the metastatic setting, whether they preferred quality of life or length of life. And as you can see here, all the younger patients preferred length of life. And if you look at the patients over the age of 65, half of them preferred quality of life. And there was also, of course, a group that preferred length of life. But there's a huge difference across the age groups, as you can see here. What does that mean? that does mean that you have to measure what is meaningful to a patient, and is your study population representative in this case for all elderly, and are the drugs not too toxic. So we designed a trial where we compared, I will show that here, where we will compare through 2 schedules of doxorubicin, that's chemotherapy, with another drug that's an oral drug. And based on the fact that elderly find quality of life so important, we made that even our primary endpoint, where of course we also looked at disease parameters. So that's important, that you can design trials based on what patients tell you, what they find important, and then consider, well, what your primary endpoint of such a study may be, and whether this will be attractive, we will see, because that's a totally new study concept. So the best trial recruitment are the trials where there is a novel and very promising treatment, because patients really want to participate, of course. And to get such a treatment, it's only possible in the context of a clinical study. And examples are imatinib in GIST and all the immunotherapy trials in melanoma, lung cancer, and many other tumor types. Difficult recruitment, if it's a very rare indication, we have what we call targeted agents on track, but it's a very rare target. The drugs are really very great, but we have really difficulty to find these patients. Or very complex studies are also difficult to recruit, and also difficult for the staff, like the new cell therapy studies. We have them here up and running in the Netherlands Cancer Institute, and I see how complex they are. And too many studies in parallel in the same patient group with the same disease stage may also make per study the difficulty in recruitment, and the study may be too burdensome for patients. So it's important that doctors know whether there are clinical trials for the patients, and also that patients are aware that you really can find a lot yourself already. Website, patient advocacy groups know a lot. But first ask your own oncologist, and this is an important website where you'll find loads of clinical trials. Not all academic trials, smaller trials in hospitals are always here, but in fact they should be there so that everyone can see them. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Annette. That was a very broad and quite fascinating insight into the challenges that the doctors face in terms of developing and bringing forward a clinical study. Thank you. We're going to move on to the patient viewpoint now, the patient viewpoint of this issue. And Emma Kinloch, who I've worked with here in the UK quite a lot, comes from a rare cancer background, and she'll explain a little more about that in a moment. But she herself is an expert on explaining clinical trials to other patients. And Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm going to share my screen. If you could kindly let me know if it's worked or not. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you, Roger, and thank you very much to EORTC for inviting me to speak today. And also thank you to the previous speakers for their fantastic and very interesting presentations. Some of the points that they've touched on, I will also touch on, but with the lens of a patient. So, as Roger said, I'm Emma Kinloch. I was diagnosed in 2012 with a rare salivary gland cancer called adenoid cystic carcinoma, for which at the time and still now there are very limited treatment options and there are no targeted drug treatments. I would have loved to take part in a trial, but there weren't any that were applicable to me at the time, and there was very little research being done. So I sort of, through a long journey, I started a support group, and the journey took me to getting quite involved in PPI, or patient advocacy. and I'm now the consumer lead for the National Cancer Research Institute in the UK, where I work with Roger. And I also started a micro charity, as I call it, Salivary Gland Cancer UK, in collaboration with a medical oncologist. We're working to improve the, well, to start trials and to provide information and to support patients. So let's go back to clinical trials. Now, let me just. Why would you or I take part? Well, quite simply, you might help your own situation. You may be in a position where there are no regular treatment options for you, and there may be new treatments being tested. These new treatments could potentially help you fight the disease that you have much better and give you a longer lifespan or a better quality of life, as has been described. Of course, these new treatments may have different risks to you, but those will be explained to you during the trial. We've all heard of proton beam therapy. That's something that's being trialled at the moment. Is it actually better than other types of radiotherapy? Is there a new type of surgery which might mean that you might keep your eye or not have to have some form of bag or ongoing treatments? There are really important questions. Also, you may have had a treatment a while ago, and researchers may want to investigate whether there are new treatments that would make you feel better, much further down the road. And you may have heard of living with and beyond cancer. There's a big movement to understand, because so many of us are living with cancer, how we can have the best lives possible and how we can adapt the treatments that we have to ensure that in the long term, the least damage possible is done. So even if it doesn't help us, we might help other patients in the same situation. And even if immediately, benefits aren't seen, as was mentioned earlier, we can really help researchers and clinicians understand more about a disease or a treatment. And that is also very valuable. Collaboration. Collaboration is the action of working with someone to produce something. And I really see patients taking part in clinical trials as being a true form of collaboration. If patients didn't exist, there wouldn't be any trials. By taking part in trials, we are working with the clinicians and the researchers to move things forward for us all. And at this point, I'd also like to mention that it's important that we as patients are also able to help researchers by inputting into the development of these trials. And that's the work that I do in the UK and that people like Roger and many others of us do. We want to help researchers and clinicians prioritise what are the most important things from a patient perspective to focus on. As was described earlier, if a trial isn't important to us, we're not going to take part. So please do have a think about, as you listen to all of these presentations, patient advocacy or PPI. Back to the trial. What might you be asked to do? Well, you might be asked to donate some tissue, your tumour, or have some blood taken at several points. You might be asked to share your data. You might be asked to take a drug, try a new therapy, or a new AI, a new app, a new way of working. You might have to attend different treatments and different appointments. You might have to keep a log or a journal of how you feel, fill in questionnaires, take part in interviews. Everything and anything that you are asked to do as part of a trial will have been through rigorous development, ethics committees, legal sign-offs within organisations, within universities, within hospitals. There are strict laws and regulations around how trials are run, how patients are looked after in trials, and it was talked about earlier how we're looked after when we're taking part. Stop, go. Is this still suitable? Are our patients okay? So there's no need to be fearful of them. When it comes to your data, there are many rules around that as well. And biobanking, your data and your tissue is safe. They are precious things. They should be kept safe. So hopefully this all sounds great and you're asking, where do I sign up? Well, as mentioned earlier, hopefully your treating clinicians will be able to tell you about trials that might be of interest or applicable to your situation or your specific cancer. However, this can be very different depending on where you live. Some clinicians and some hospitals may not be involved in research or particularly up to date about your particular cancer. Even if they are up to date, and we've seen this a lot recently because of COVID, they may be resource constrained, or they may be deployed to a different area, or as touched on earlier, trials take time and they need a lot of support. They might quite simply not have enough people to help at the time. Also, as mentioned, other patient groups are often experts in these fields, and you might want to reach out to them to find out what's going on in your particular disease. And this is especially important in rare diseases. You can also do your own research via the internet, but I would always caution that, go through reputable websites. And then if you were to donate, for example, your tissue to a biobank, they may store that. And if they've profiled your tumour and in the future they find a drug that they'd like to test, for example, on a mutation they saw in your tumour, if you've registered your interest, they can reach out to you and invite you to take part in the trial. And the last point I'd like to say is about trial documentation. When you are described in a trial, when you are enrolled in a trial or told about a trial, you'll be provided with a plain English summary. And this should tell you everything that you need to know. This should be a simple explanation of the trial, what you have to do without any jargon. And it's only when you've confirmed that you understand this and about what you're being asked to do and what the trial's trying to do, then you confirm your consent to take part. So we touched on this earlier, and I'm nearly at the end. You've decided you want to take part in the trial, but what trials can you take part in? So obviously you need to meet certain criteria, which might be your age, any previous treatments may have a bearing on that, your fitness level. Just by saying you want to take part in a trial, sadly, doesn't guarantee you a place. And then there are a multitude of complexities and issues around cross-border collaboration within your own country or area, but also between countries. And again, this is very important for rare cancer patients. If you find trials and you're confirmed you're able to participate, actually, do you have to travel? Is there financial support for this? Where are you going to stay? Who's going to help you out? And more recently, can you do this virtually? And I think actually this is going to take something positive from coronavirus. It could be more thinking around how we can participate virtually in trials. What parts of the process can we do without physically being there? It was touched on earlier, there are a number of databases where you can have a good explore and see if any of trials are out there specific to you. And then finally, my last slide, to bring all of that together. So my key message is that we can really help clinicians and researchers as patients by working with them. If we take part in trials, we can help ourselves, we can help others, and we help our treating clinicians and researchers. Trials lead to better outcomes and treatment options for patients, and that doesn't mean that every trial shows what it's meant to show, or that new treatments are always verified. But every bit of information gathered is important and goes towards that bigger picture. Trials are safe. They're regulated and they're safe. You and your data and your samples are precious and they're held securely and safely. You can find out about them in a number of ways, as we've talked about. And if you take part in this collaborative process, you're helping make things better for us all. And with that, I will say thank you very much and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Emma. That was a lovely dash through the patient viewpoint. I concur with virtually everything you say there. I relate to it from my own experience. Marguerite, you've been gathering comments that have been coming through on the chat function. Are there any questions which stand out to you that we should ask straight away?
We don't have any questions yet. So
Okay,
if you
understood.
have any
Well,
questions, feel free to
yes.
write them in the chats.
Yes, please ask questions in the chat. In the meantime, then I'll ask a couple of questions. For Willette and Jessica, Emma raised there the issue of cross-border recruitment into trials going between countries. Do you have any experience of that from your own clinical practice? Jessica, perhaps? No? Yes?
So yes, before moving back to Italy, I worked 1.5 years in Gustave Roussy in Paris in a phase 1 clinical trial unit of Gustave Roussy. So of course we had patients from abroad coming to participate to phase 1 trials. I don't know how it works in Netherlands. Winnet certainly will say on that, but certainly in France the flexibility of getting patients from abroad was there. So we could easily enroll them in clinical trials, both patients coming from Europe and conventional patients coming from Northern Africa. So for example, Morocco and Tunisia. So for that we did not face any problem. For example, I can compare with Italy, it would be more complicated to have here patients from abroad. Regulations are here stricter on that side.
Understood. Were those patients that came, did they receive any financial support from the hospital or the clinical study to help them with accommodation costs or travel?
Yeah, so there we have the bias that these were phase 1 trials, and therefore patients were paid for the travel, so they get compensated and reimbursed for any expense.
Oh, that's good.
There were phase 1 trials again. So
phase 1, of course, yes, early phase studies, yes. Winnet, have you any experience of this?
Yes, we have. As we have no private practice in the Netherlands, we can't take these patients on board. So we have not an opportunity that patients can take part in studies in general. Maybe there are a few exceptions in some hospitals, but I'm not aware of it because we don't have the system of private clinics, because often in private clinics, patients can participate in studies when they come from other countries.
So it would only be Dutch nationals who can effectively...
Well, at least people who have their insurance here, health insurance. Yeah.
Right. Understood. So not necessarily a national, but a insurance within the country. Yeah. So I think that illustrates immediately the complexity of the cross-border issues. You know, easier in France, more difficult in Italy, impossible in the Netherlands. And I know there's a spectrum of issues about attending clinical trials from abroad in the UK. So that's one that's going to be unique, and if you face it as a patient, it's one that I'm not sure that there are a lot of resources to help you address at the moment. An issue perhaps for the whole patient community to be thinking about. And Winnet, you talked about quality of life and patient-reported outcomes, and both Jessica and Emma mentioned it as well. Can you, each of you, give me a reflection on how you think we should be looking at the quality of life appraisal within clinical studies? Emma, do you want to go first on that?
Sure, thank you, Roger. I mean, I may say this several times, but I think you need to ask the patients. And I think it's a really good example of where patients can really add value when you're developing a trial. My background, as I've mentioned, is head and neck cancer. When you're discussing with a group of head and neck cancer patients, you know, swallowing and chewing and saliva, how that relates to the dosage of radiotherapy, for example, it's very important whether you'll be able to only drink soup or eat pasta or a pizza. And they sound like silly things, but they are so important. Can you go out for dinner with your friends? Can you have people, you know, it's a life-changing measure, if you like, which you may not think of unless you've actually had those issues. So yes, involve the patients in thinking what those are is my message. Thank you.
Understood, yes. Jessica, did you have any opportunity to work with the quality of life group at EORTC when you were there?
Yes, definitely. So both in the lung and head and neck cancer group, and certainly, as Emma said, the role of the patient here is key, both in developing the protocols and getting them, the protocols, I'm sorry, and the questionnaires. So the quality of life questionnaires, when they get developed, the input of the patients is really necessary. So on that, I know that the quality of life group is working on that, but certainly there is still room for improvement.
Thank you. You mentioned using quality of life as a primary outcome measure in the study you've been developing, Wynette. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about how you see quality of life as a discipline within clinical research.
Yeah, I think for long, quality of life has been the kind of add-on to clinical studies where, oh yes, we also have to fill in questionnaires or we have to present them to patients. And I'm afraid many of all these questionnaires were never evaluated unless the FDA or the EMA were asking for it. But there is a change. I think it felt more important and maybe, well, particularly, for example, in drug studies, the question is whether they ask the right question. As Jessica said, the quality of life group of the EORTC is developing disease-specific questionnaires on modules or questions. We have what we call an item library where there are what you were saying, Emma, about having difficulty to eat in a restaurant. These kind of things can be asked in what we call a valid question, and you can add it to your study in case that's relevant. So discussing with the patient from the beginning on how your protocol should look like and what patient really would like to have been asked makes it more relevant and makes it also more doable to do it in the right way. Because if we ask every week them to fill in questionnaires, that will also not work.
Yeah.
So how do you do it? How often? When? Before or after chemotherapy? I think these are issues we never really addressed in a proper way. And that's something, a challenge for the near future. I wonder what Emma thinks of that, but that's my opinion. We never consider when we provide patients with these questionnaires.
Do you want to reflect, Emma?
Well, I do think that some of the questionnaires are quite involved, absolutely, but also I do think with questionnaires, if you're going to fill one in at a certain point in time, many patients would be happy to complete it again at a later point in time. And I think when you're talking about quality of life and living with and beyond cancer, when you've made that commitment to help research in that area, you understand that the long-term view is important. And I also think that patients, when they undertake to fill in a questionnaire, realise it might be quite lengthy, but the importance of it. But of course, we should always try and keep them as, valid as possible and ensure that what we're asking is actually going to be used in the analysis. And also that the whole questionnaire, to your point, Wynette, will actually be looked at to be analysed. I mean, that's a key point.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been intrigued here in the UK during this COVID experience that a study set up at King's College London, which started out in a very modest way, using people's smartphones and just giving a very simple questionnaire of 2 or 3 questions to be answered every day, now has nearly 6 million people taking part. It's a tribute to the use of the technology in this kind of area, and I think this kind of technology will actually help quality of life and patient-reported outcomes become a core part of clinical life and of clinical research. So going beyond research and coming into clinical practice, I certainly hope so.
Actually, there's a question in the. I know you can't read it, but there's a question.
Yes,
in the
indeed, we
chat.
have a comment.
Oh, please, yes.
And maybe it would be interesting to have your insight on this, Roger. The comment is, as a participant of a trial, I would like to be informed about the results of the trial, and afterwards, when the results are known, about having been part of the placebo arm or the drug arm.
I fully agree. The clinical trial I was on was actually stopped about a year after I finished my treatment. But the results of it were published 5 years later. When it was published, I have to say not too many of the patients who were treated were still alive. And that raises, I think, a number of the questions which have always been brought up when the issue of publicising the results of a trial are discussed. And the key one is, you can't necessarily keep track of all the patients, and you can't expect them to know when they can call you to get the results. But if someone has died and you have contacted their home number with a letter perhaps addressed to their home, who are you going to upset? You know, a husband, a wife, children, parents who've lost someone as a result of treatment in a cancer study. You know, it's a very sensitive sort of issue there. So it's got a lot more depth than the simplistic answer of saying, yes, we should be told the results.
But I think that there's also the question on whether you want to know whether you be on a placebo arm. That was in the chat also mentioned. When do I know after a trial that I was part of the placebo arm?
Well, I think the only thing you can do is ask your clinician, ask your investigator, but it probably won't be happy to do that until the trial has actually been reported and the data has been locked down for analysis. There are always fears about biasing results, and locking the data for analysis is probably the key point. Would you agree with that? I see Jessica nodding, but would you agree with that, Winette? Yes. The challenge there, obviously being on a placebo arm and knowing that you've been on a placebo arm is something you really do want to know, whether you were treatment or placebo. And of course, in cancer, a lot of studies are now, where there is a placebo arm, may have a crossover function if disease progresses. So that's another thing to look for with the design of a trial, whether there is a crossover function, so that if you are randomized to be on a placebo arm, if the disease advances, what is the plan? Do you just revert to standard treatment? Do you cross over to the active treatment in the clinical study and stay in the clinical study? Those are questions that can be asked. Are there any more questions in the chat, Marguerite?
No more.
No?
Thank you.
Well, we are running out of time. Are there any just final words that any of our three speakers would like to add in to close the discussion? Emma.
I'd just like to say a big thank you to Jessica and Winette and all the other treating clinicians and researchers who think about, work in, and spend an awful lot of time and energy in doing these trials for us. So thank you. We stand ready to work with you.
Good. Thank you. Anything you would like to say, Jessica or Winette?
Well, that's a very nice comment, and I think we should even work more together to make the trials even better. Thank you.
Here's that. Jessica?
Absolutely, I share exactly the same view.
Thank you. It's nice to have complete consensus, complete collaboration around the table. That's nice. I hope you have found what we've had to say this afternoon interesting, and I hope you'll find it useful. And if you are looking for a clinical trial and you're looking for treatment with cancer, can we wish you all the very best and success with that treatment. And to everyone, thank you for attending. Thank you for being with us.